This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Hello, I'm Ritula Shah. Thank you for downloading the World Tonight podcast on Wednesday, the 30th of January. On the programme, Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn held their first talks about Brexit. We ask, with the clock ticking, are MPs now ready to reach some kind of cross-party consensus on Brexit, or are the divisions just too deep? Also, we report from Zimbabwe, where the fuel protests have ended, but the military crackdown continues. A member of Venezuela's opposition tells us why he believes President Maduro will be brought down by the force of public opinion. And we hear from the US school moving to a 4-day week. It was the morning after the night before, and the European Union woke up and said no. In yesterday's Brexit vote, British MPs voted for Theresa May to seek alternative arrangements to the Irish backstop, which is part of the withdrawal agreement or divorce deal. But this morning, there was little in the way of encouragement from those who needed persuading.
The withdrawal agreement remains the best and only deal possible. The debate and votes in the House of Commons yesterday do not change that. The withdrawal agreement will not be renegotiated.
The EU institutions remain united, and we stand by the agreement we have negotiated with the UK.
The withdrawal agreement, including the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, is not open for renegotiation. We're at a ratification process now, not still in negotiation. The solidarity across Europe on this, I think, speaks for itself.
Well, that was Jean-Claude Juncker, Michel Barnier and Simon Coveney. The Irish backstop is a position of last resort to maintain an open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic in the event that the UK leaves the EU without securing an all-encompassing deal. At the moment, the backstop would effectively keep the UK inside the EU's customs union, but with Northern Ireland also conforming to some rules of the single market. Critics say a different status for Northern Ireland could undermine the union, and they fear that the backstop could become permanent. At Prime Minister's questions, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said changes to the backstop arrangements wouldn't be enough to unite the country. The Prime Minister urged Mr Corbyn to put forward his own ideas for a workable deal.
You can't just vote to reject no deal. You have to vote for a deal. Otherwise, you leave with no deal. So far, he has opposed everything this government has put forward in relation to a deal. And he said previously he will reject any deal that the government puts on the table.
But as agreed yesterday, Theresa May met Jeremy Corbyn for talks about Brexit. Afterwards, Mr Corbyn gave his verdict on the meeting.
She listened. I listened to her replies, of course, and we then discussed various issues surrounding the problems of the backstop, which she is going to talk to the EU about. And I pointed out that this would be the first time in British history we'd entered into an arrangement with, a treaty arrangement with anybody else in which there was no right to leave, because it would be a decision could be made only by the other side. And she's heard these arguments before, and she certainly understood the point that we were making.
So do you have a serious problem with the backstop? Mm-hmm. You have a serious problem with the backstop yourself?
I have a problem where we go into an agreement which is one-sided. I want an agreement which is mutual. And so the point I was making was the Labour position is that we want a comprehensive customs union with the European Union, with a say in how those trade arrangements are made. And we put that point very clearly to it. And I explained that in the House yesterday in the debate.
Well, this evening, Theresa May has had, we're told, a lengthy phone conversation with the European Council President, Donald Tusk. The exchange was described as open and frank, which is diplomatic code for bad-tempered. Mr Tusk explained again that renegotiating the document governing the UK's withdrawal from the European Union was simply not an option. Well, our political correspondent Alex Forsyth joins me now. Alex, Donald Tusk reiterating the line that European leaders have been sticking to today. But what about those talks with Jeremy Corbyn? Is there any way to judge how well they went from what we've heard?
Well, I think what we see is Theresa May taking a twin-track approach, knowing that really her options are very limited. She knows that she's getting those emphatic no's from the EU at the moment about her possible renegotiation, but she is still ploughing on, saying that there are possible options that can be explored. She's going to meet with MPs to pursue that over the course of the next few days. And at the same time, I think she's conscious that even if she does secure a change to that backstop, it might not be enough to get the deal through Parliament, so she's pursuing Labour support where she can. And as you heard from Jeremy Corbyn, he said it was an exploratory meeting, a serious meeting. He continued to press his case for some sort of customs union. Now, at this point, the Prime Minister doesn't appear to be softening on that, but it may be that she has to look again at that position if she's going to pull in some Labour support.
Let's talk about process. Theresa May is going to Brussels. However negative their first reaction may appear to be, there will be a negotiation of sorts. But what happens once she's back in Westminster with whatever she's got once that renegotiation's finished?
Well, what we expect over the next few days are conversations to continue, not immediately jumping on a plane to go to the EU for face-to-face talks. If anything, that might come next week, although nothing is guaranteed on that front. If and when she gets something, she'll have to bring it back to Parliament for another meaningful vote. Now, she's imposed upon herself a 2-week deadline, saying that if she can bring back a deal or not, she will still return within 2 weeks to the House of Commons to signal her next steps. And at that chance, MPs will get another opportunity to try and shape what they want from Brexit. So we could see a rerun of them putting forward different suggestions, whether that's extending the process or pursuing a second referendum. So I think what it feels like is we're going round in circles, although Downing Street will say, with Parliament having backed the idea of renegotiating the deal despite the EU protestations, and Jeremy Corbyn now opening the door for talks, that are two very small steps forward. Whether she can get any further along on this journey, well, that remains to be seen.
Alex Forsyth, thank you very much. Well, speaking before the May-Corbyn meeting today, the EU Parliament's Brexit coordinator, Guy Verhofstadt, called for a cross-party agreement in the UK that could be a solution to the current impasse.
I hope that they will decide, or that they will discuss content, and that is not only eating biscuits and drinking tea this afternoon. Because it could be the solution for this problem if they start to working together on a cross-party approach so that we know what the position of the UK is in the future. Because we don't know it.
Well, how likely is it, though, with fewer than 60 days before Brexit Day, that MPs could set aside their differences and arrive at some kind of consensus? Conservative MPs with very different views of Brexit, crudely Remainers and Brexiteers, came together to arrive at what's become known as the Kit Malthouse Compromise. And compromise really isn't a word you hear very often in connection with Brexit. So if the EU was to agree to alternative arrangements to the backstop, the Malthouse Compromise could provide the template. It includes extending the transition period for a year, protecting EU citizens' rights and using technology to avoid customs checks on the Irish border instead of using the backstop. Stephen Hammond's a Conservative MP and Health Minister. He was one of those involved in those compromise talks. What does he believe is the likelihood of some kind of consensus?
Well, I think it's good news they're in the room together. I think it's very good news that Jeremy Corbyn has accepted the Prime Minister's offer. I expect that initially both sides will be talking from different positions, but in all talks you can slightly move, and I guess the Prime Minister will be wanting to find out exactly what Mr Corbyn wants. So he will have undoubtedly said he wants a customs union, and she'll be saying, well, that's not what I want. So I suspect although it was more than cordial, the first part of it was probably sort of a conversation where both sides are trying to work out where they can move the other side to.
You were part of what yesterday we were talking about, the Kit Malthouse Compromise. Compromise, a word that hasn't been used a great deal in relation to Brexit. That was cross-party. Are there lessons that you would draw from that experience that could be applied between conversations between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition?
Well, it was all members of the Conservative Party, but from certainly very opposing views on Brexit. I think, first of all, conversations should not leak, and the Prime Minister clearly never leaks, and Mr Corbyn hasn't leaked the details, so I think that's a good start in terms of establishing trust. Secondly, you've got to be able to talk frankly about the limitations of what you think the other side's plan is, but also recognise how far you're prepared to move, and we were able to do that in conversations, but it involves some fairly frank and sometimes quite difficult exchanges of views.
Guy Verhofstadt, the chief negotiator for the European Parliament, has said that he wants to see a big cross-party consensus. Is it possible to get there? Yes, you might get a few people having negotiations, Cooper Bowles, Labour and the Conservatives, but can you see big movements in numbers, a real consensus around an issue, given the depth of the differences?
Well, it's going to require some pretty big movements in position if that's what is achieved. I think the most important thing is to get it would be very helpful if we could see a large cross-party solution. It would be very helpful if that were a signal to our partners in Europe and they were prepared to look at what would achieve that as well. No one should underestimate the difficulties. If this were easy, we would have done it 2 years ago. One of the things we've never recognised right from the beginning is just how tough this was always going to be.
But look, a specific example might be Labour wants a customs union. Can you imagine Theresa May saying, OK, here's your customs union. I'm going to take the Labour votes, alienate a core section of my party who've played quite a prominent role in all of this so far. Could you imagine a compromise around something like that?
Well, again, the trouble is that whilst Mrs May be able to get some Conservatives through the lobby on that, she may not be able to get everybody, and nor actually, of course, at the moment would Jeremy Corbyn get all of his party through the lobby on that. The proposal we put forward earlier in the week, I think, is a proposal where actually a lot of the Labour Party, if they start to think about it, could also unite around.
So this is the Kit Malthouse compromise, but there's been lots of criticisms of that, not least how the detail would work and whether the EU would actually accept the idea that you could have a withdrawal agreement without the backstop.
Well, it's not a withdrawal agreement without the backstop. The backstop is just positioned in a different way. There is an indefinite guarantee within the whole proposal. So, I think that there's been a lot of characterisation of it by people who probably haven't looked at the detail. And so I think that once people start to do that, you'll see this is, firstly, absolutely stops no deal. Secondly, it guarantees rights in Northern Ireland and Ireland, so there's no hard border. And thirdly, it allows everybody to argue about what the future relationship might be, but gives people the chance a bit more space to come to some compromise on that.
Health Minister Stephen Hammond, an indication perhaps of how difficult it is to get any kind of consensus, let alone from across parties, came from the Business Secretary, Greg Clark, in the same government as Stephen Hammond, of course. Speaking on the Peston programme on ITV this evening, he said he didn't think the technical possibilities were there yet for the Malthouse compromise to work. That's just within one party. Well, let's hear from Labour. Owen Smith is a former Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary and one-time leadership challenger to Jeremy Corbyn. He joins me now. Good evening.
Good evening.
Owen Smith, I know you've had your differences with the Labour leadership, but set those aside for a moment. Put yourself in Jeremy Corbyn's shoes. How would you approach this if you really wanted to arrive at some kind of deal over Brexit?
Well, I'd be taking the mandate that I was given by the members of the Labour Party and ratified at our conference, and I'd have gone into today's meeting saying very clearly that Labour believes that there ought to be, for democratic reasons and because we believe Brexit is bad for the economy and bad for Britain, that there ought to be a second referendum at the end of this process.
But what's the evidence that there's the votes for that in Parliament? If you're looking for a consensus that would actually get a big vote in Parliament, it doesn't appear to be that the second referendum is one of them. It didn't even come up for an amendment yesterday.
Well, it did, if in effect. It came up in Labour's amendment. It was explicitly referenced there in the second part of our amendment.
Indeed, which was defeated. You're quite right, and it was defeated.
It was, but really interestingly, 241 Labour MPs voted for that, including some of the people whom we've often thought as being a bit more Eurosceptic. So I think the truth is the only prospect of there being a second referendum is if the Labour Party backs that full-throatedly,
okay.
And if Jeremy Corbyn
let's say
do
for a moment
that, but he's not done it so far.
Okay, well, let's say for a moment the Labour leadership does do that. What's the likelihood that you would then get the votes from the Conservative side? Because what we're talking about, what we're trying to find here, is an idea that would get an overwhelming consensus in Parliament.
Well, look, I don't think there's much prospect of that. I think the problem is, and what I've always feared, is that Theresa May's had a very simple playbook here. What she's wanted to do was to carry on holding out that binary choice between her deal and no deal, hanging no deal over us all as a threat in anticipation that at the last gasp either the ERG will fold or the Labour Party will in part fold and it will go through on the back of Labour votes. And the reason she looks so content today is it's clearly working. Yesterday evening the ERG decided to put their swords back in their sheaths and offer her support, and some Labour members effectively offered some support for or some encouragement.
You're telling us about the differences that we know exist. They're there. There's no denying them. But what is the way through then? What happens next week when all of this comes back, with or without some kind of renegotiation from Brussels, and MPs get to have another say?
But Ridley, you've got the wrong guy on the show if you want me to say what's the way in which I pursue Brexit. I think Labour ought to be resisting Brexit. I think there is no such thing as a good Brexit, a jobs-first Brexit, a Brexit that's going to offer electoral advantage. There is, and I've always said that we ought to test whether the people want that referendum to be followed through once we know what a real Brexit is. I genuinely believe, Rissler, that there are people on our side and on the Tory side, obviously, who think there may be some good that comes from Brexit, and I think there are many others who think we've got to honour the referendum. But I'm not one of the people who feels that there's any good thing that's going to come out of this Brexit deal.
And how do you answer the criticism that heading to a second referendum potentially could end you up with no deal?
Well, again, I don't think there's any real likelihood of that, because I think it's always been a false threat that Theresa May has hung over us. I don't think she is genuinely going to take us over the cliff, and I don't think the European Union will allow that either. I think the most likely scenario, unfortunately, is that her hardball has worked and the European Union will offer some movement, and that will be sufficient for the DUP and ERG armchair generals to back off and for Brexit to go through, possibly even with the support of some Labour people. But the truth is, we will then, I think, be blamed for that just as much as the Tories. Rittler, very many people in Labour, I think, around the leadership, hope that Labour will get through without our fingers being dipped in the blood, but I don't think that's right, and I think people will blame Labour in the long run.
Owen Smith, thank you very much. And I think we didn't manage to get any consensus there at all, as far as I could see. Zimbabwe's police have appealed for victims of human rights abuses to come forward and report any assaults to the police. Protests against a fuel price rise ended nearly 2 weeks ago, but there are reports that a crackdown by security forces has continued. President Mnangagwa has appointed a task force to look into abuses by soldiers. But as our correspondent Andrew Harding reports from the capital Harare, people remain fearful of the military's tactics.
Soldiers come and just a random beating you.
Soldiers shoot me.
They beat me on my left arm and it was broken.
In a private clinic in Harare, a dozen new victims of the army's ongoing crackdown.
They beat me with the baton stick.
Uniformed soldiers, a fracture on my left hand.
Soldiers come and collect us.
These men, too scared to be named, say they were assaulted on the city streets in broad daylight.
Then we hear people shouting, "Soldiers, soldiers." Then my husband woke up.
At night, there are other reasons to be scared here. This woman was one of 6 who told us she'd been raped by soldiers.
They slapped me. They said they want to have sex with me. I was so scared. The first soldier, he had sex with me. And the other one said, I want to do the same.
Was it clear to you that this was being done to punish you, to punish the neighbourhood?
Yes.
Remember, these are soldiers, not the police. The army seemingly on the rampage in a country that is not at war. There aren't even street protests right now. Blessing Gorajena runs Zimbabwe's Human Rights Forum.
Why is the repression continuing? Why are the attacks continuing in the suburbs? And why is it that it's happening in the middle of the night where people's homes are being invaded and people assaulted indiscriminately, like what is happening?
And this is unprovoked now?
I think surely we can conclude that it's unprovoked. This is actually systematic with a targeted motive, which we are yet to establish.
You've seen violence here over the years. Is this different?
Unfortunately, we actually seeing an escalation in terms of the pattern. It's openly happening in the streets, and the role of military is quite worrisome as well.
Normally they are coming with a twin-cab Ford Ranger white in colour and registered vehicle.
In the suburbs of Harare, we met several opposition MDC councillors like Jason Kautsa, who said they'd been forced into hiding.
I'm just being afraid of being kidnapped and disappear. I'm not afraid of arrested.
But you think that's a realistic possibility?
Yeah, the possibility for them to kidnap is high because they are coming at night. If they want to arrest a person, they can come daylight.
Prisoners, some in shackles, arrive at the magistrates' court. The government insists the law is taking its course, that alleged abuses by the security forces will be dealt with just like vandals and violent protesters. But the opposition leader, Nelson Chamisa, is unconvinced.
What we have is almost a de facto state of emergency, if it has not been declared, but that is what we are living under. It also shows you that we are back to the old days of dictatorship, the days of tyranny, the days of terror, the days of fear.
President Mnangagwa has called for national dialogue with you. Why don't you accept that?
I've accepted dialogue. In fact, I'm the one who started to call him for dialogue, but he doesn't understand dialogue. Now, you can't indicate left and turn right. You can't talk dialogue and act violence.
A well-placed military source has told us this crackdown will continue for some time, that the president has sanctioned it, and that soldiers have been told to use sticks and batons, not bullets, to crush dissent. So what now? Long queues for rationed bread in a Harare supermarket. The economic misery, which triggered the recent protests and the army's crackdown, is only getting more acute. College lecturer David Zatsunga.
People are desperate. People are desperate because they are supposed to continue to come to work, but the money that they are earning is not enough for transport. They can't pay school fees. Their children are sitting at home. So really, it's more of desperation than anything else.
The government says that such hardship is proof that its economic reforms are working, that people must be patient. At the same time, the soldiers remain on the streets, doling out what seems to many here like collective punishment.
Andrew Harding reporting. There were protests across Venezuela today. Venezuelans were responding to a call from the opposition leader, Juan Guaidó. He'd urged people to leave their homes and workplaces for 2 hours to express their opposition to the government of Nicolas Maduro. It was the first mass demonstration since Mr. Guaidó declared himself interim president last week. America's recognised Juan Guaidó. President Trump phoned him ahead of the protest to offer his support. But President Maduro isn't backing down. In a video posted online, he warned the US against plotting what he called a coup.
The campaign has been prepared to justify a coup in Venezuela. We will not allow a Vietnam in Latin America. Otherwise, if the United States intervenes here, it will have a Vietnam worse than it can imagine. They want to put their hands on our oil, like they did in Iran, like they did in Libya.
Mr. Maduro also told a Russian news agency that he wouldn't stand down, but was willing to discuss holding fresh parliamentary elections. Armando Armas is a member of Venezuela's National Assembly, who's from Juan Guaidó's Popular Will Party. He gave me his reasons for why President Maduro had to go.
He's a narco trafficker, he's corrupt, he's a murderer, he's going to be presented at the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity.
Those are very serious allegations. For now, he is claiming the right to the presidency. It is in Juan Guaidó's interest to have some kind of negotiations with him. How can you bring him to the table?
We have tried many times to bring these people to the table. The problem here is that we haven't had any clear and fair and free electoral process. As you know, Venezuela, it's a presidential republic. So even though the Democratic Coalition won the overwhelming majority, the things that we could do from the parliament are limited. And even though that are limited, we were suppressed. The majority of the political parties are banned, and main political leaders, they are prosecuted in jail, in prison, or in the exile.
So in those circumstances that you describe, how can Juan Guaidó ensure that there is some kind of peaceful transition, whatever that means?
We would love to have a peaceful transition. We don't want war, but conflict is among us. 28,000 people are being killed every year because of criminality by the regime.
So would you support the removal of President Maduro by any means necessary, including US military action, if that's what it came to?
No. The principal aim of our movement is to have free and fair elections. So we do need a transitional government because we are under an illegitimate dictatorship. So we want free and fair elections.
How do you think you can get to free and fair elections? How will that happen?
Well, the majority of the population mobilize, and with the cooperation of the international community, United States among them, of course, and the European Union, and Colombia, and Brazil, and many others. So United States is not the main, or it's not the key player here. It's our neighbors in Latin America.
What sort of pushback do you think Mr. Guaido is going to face? We know that Mr. Maduro has the backing of Russia, China, Mexico and Turkey. There has been this story circulating today about a mysterious plane parked in Caracas that many people believe may be taking gold out of the country. It may be a Russian plane. What does that suggest to you about the tenacity of those who back President Maduro?
Well, according to official declarations of the Russian government, I don't think they're very, very prompt to back Maduro as many people think. I think this is a propaganda maneuver, but they do want to cash what the regime owns them. They are creditors of Venezuela for more than $12 billion or something like that. I'm talking about Russia here. So, of course, they want to get paid. And we do guarantee a negotiation with the creditors to pay our debts. But we do have to take care about our priorities, which is the humanitarian crisis, shortages of food and medicine, hyperinflations. Those are the priorities here in Venezuela right now.
That's a member of the opposition in Venezuela, Armando Armas. Yemen's been devastated by a conflict that began in 2014. A coalition led by Saudi Arabia, including Yemeni government troops and supported by the Americans, has been battling the Houthis, a group with links to Iran. But there's another war going on in Yemen that we've heard little about, the US's fight against al-Qaeda. A BBC Arabic investigation has uncovered evidence that this US operation has recently escalated, that a significant number of Yemeni civilians have been killed, and that the US's other strategic aims in Yemen are being undermined. Safa Al-Ahmad has gained rare access to the areas targeted by these US attacks. She met survivors, found evidence of undeclared civilian casualties and blunders by US special forces.
I'm on the way to a small village in central Yemen called Yekla. I've been covering the devastating war here since it began 4 years ago. I'm back to investigate a different conflict, the escalation of the US fight against al-Qaeda in the country. There has been little reporting on the ground about what Washington is doing here. But 2 years ago, an attack by US Special Forces on Yekla became headline news.
U.S. forces launched a surprise raid in Yemen overnight,
targeting an al-Qaeda camp in southern Yemen.
A highly successful raid that will lead to many more victories in the future against our enemy.
It was authorized by President Trump during his first days in office, citing concerns the group was planning attacks on Western targets. One American soldier was killed and 3 others were injured. The military said they eliminated at least 14 al-Qaeda members. But I heard that many civilians also died. I wanted to go see for myself. Yekla is a dangerous place to get to because it sits in the middle of several front lines. The village once housed 800 residents, but today it is mostly in ruins. Several houses still bear the scars of the attack, their walls riddled with bullet marks, showing the intensity of the firefight that night.
I'll speak the truth. God knows if it will be used against me.
Local tribal leader Sheikh Abdullah al-Dhahab has been in hiding ever since the raid and has not been interviewed until now. He says he and his tribe have been fighting the Houthis, on the side backed by the United States.
They said the women took fighting positions. Why would they when they don't even know how to carry a weapon? In our tribe, the men are the ones who fight. And the children? Were they in fighting positions? More children were killed than women.
International human rights groups have investigated the raid and say more than 20 civilians were killed. The villagers say the number was closer to 30, the youngest, a 3-month-old baby. I traveled several hours north to the site of another attack on a tiny village called Adlan. It happened in May 2017 and is the largest known U.S. Special Forces ground raid in the country. Here, too, there was evidence of a ferocious attack. The villagers described an apocalyptic scene. One of them is 8-year-old Mujahid.
They came from far away, very far away. There were so many of them. Each one of them had someone behind him.
Mujahid's hearing and back were damaged in the raid.
A block of cement from the roof fell on my back.
A UN investigation said 50 US soldiers were involved in the attack. In addition to 7 Al-Qaeda casualties, 5 civilians were killed, including an 80-year-old man, Nasser Mahdi. The villagers showed me some things the soldiers left behind, which included a plastic ladder. They also had a medical backpack containing a list with 22 names, assumed to be the U.S. Special Operations team on the mission. We are not publishing their names to protect their identities.
I don't understand why you would have a list of all of the people.
Leon Panetta oversaw the start of the operation in Yemen under President Obama, which mostly involved drone strikes. It was controversial from the beginning because of the risk of civilian casualties.
I think it just tells you that this is a mission gone very bad.
Panetta is skeptical about the effectiveness of the current counterterrorism mission.
It's become a humanitarian disaster. And I don't know how the hell you can do an effective job of going after terrorist targets in the middle of a maelstrom. I don't see what the end game is here.
The Pentagon declined to comment on the allegations put to them by the BBC, but said Al-Qaeda remained a threat to Americans, and that the U.S. is committed to protecting civilians in military operations. Washington's counterterrorism mission continues without debate, adding to the fear and confusion Yemenis are already feeling in the midst of this very complicated conflict.
Safa Al-Ahmed reporting. Get your hot water bottles out and switch on the electric blanket. The UK's braced for the coldest night of the winter so far. Much of the country's already covered in snow and hundreds of schools have been shut. Snow day is probably one of the most joyful phrases in the English language if you're under 18, less so if you're a parent. But what if schools permanently change their hours? In the UK, some schools are cutting teaching hours in an effort to save money. In the US state of North Dakota, a number of schools want to move to a 4-day week permanently. Cher Peplinsky is head teacher at Billings County School. She explained why.
The reasons behind it are mainly about our bus commutes. Our students are sometimes on the bus for over an hour and a half in the morning, and that's another hour and a half to an hour 45 in the afternoon. So over 3 hours on the bus is quite a long time for young children to be on a bus.
And what age are the children at the school?
3 to about 13.
So these are quite young children, and that clearly is a long time for them to be on the bus. But have you considered the impact it might have on their education? Are they going to get the same number of lessons in a week, for instance?
Yes, we want our students to be able to attain high education and academic success. So the days are going to be less, but the length of days are longer.
So what would your new day be under the 4-day week?
It would start at 8:10 and get out at 3:10.
What's been the reaction from teachers and parents?
We did a couple of community meetings to get their input and sent out surveys to our current parents and our incoming families. And we had a 93% response rate with 78% in favor of the change.
That's extraordinary. And teachers presumably welcome it because a 4-day week, well, who wouldn't like that?
They like it for a couple of reasons. I don't know if you're familiar with our two communities. We are a very spread out county with very small numbers. So all of my teachers actually drive to work over at least 30 miles a day, one way.
Oklahoma's another state where they've gone to 4 days in some counties, but that has been driven by essentially budget cuts. School budgets are stretched, teachers' pay is low, and it's a way to recruit staff and to retain staff, which is currently very difficult. That isn't the driver for you.
The drive for us is not the budget, but it is to recruit and retain high-quality teachers. There is a teacher shortage across the nation, and this 4-day may bring more interest and more applicants to our district.
And what about working parents? How will they cope with the idea that Friday's another day when their children aren't at school?
We did have some of those questions brought to us as far as needs for possible daycares, but a lot of our families are very rural families that maybe the mom or dad or both work from home as ranchers.
Have you talked to other schools that have done this?
Yes, and they've all been very happy with the change. Some of them even said that they would be afraid to go back to the way it was. You know, there was obviously some resistance, but once they got going on it, everything's been very, very positive.
And what do the school children think?
I think they're excited, but the unknowing of how it's going to be and what it's going to look like, they're excited about the possibility of our discovery days. You know, children are very resilient, so they're very adaptable to any change. I think it's going to be great here.
Cher Peplinsky, head teacher in North Dakota. Well, Lucy Rycroft-Smith is a former maths teacher who's now working as an education writer and researcher, and she joins me now. Good evening.
Hello.
Lucy Rycroft-Smith, putting aside closing schools or reducing hours to save money, which is clearly very contentious, could you see any advantage in moving to a 4-day week?
Well, there are certainly some advantages, and there has been some research done on this, mostly in the US, because actually quite a few schools in the US have adopted this system over the last 30 years or so, for some of the reasons mentioned in the interview, potentially to do with transportation costs, trying to reduce commute time for students. So aside from some of the financial things, there are good reasons why schools might do it. And lots of the research has suggested that there have been some interesting things that have also come out that would potentially...
like what?
Well, for example, there are morale benefits that have been reported.
For teachers or for pupils?
For both, interestingly. There's a potential separation a bit more between academic and extracurricular activities, which could serve students well who really want to commit to extracurricular activities but perhaps haven't had the time or the energy to do so before.
But most of the discussion around education, a lot of the discussion around education has been about longer days to support pupils who perhaps have parents who can't sit down with them and do homework, who don't necessarily have a stable home life, that kind of thing, to iron out those differences. A 4-day week would surely, for some children, be disastrous.
Well, there has been some suggestion, although there isn't at the moment any evidence to support it, and that's part of the issue. There isn't any good research on this, really. But some people have suggested potentially, yes, it may affect students who are at risk or students with particular special needs more. That at the moment isn't evidenced. One thing that people have definitely reported is that where there were babysitting issues potentially that might have happened on the day where students weren't in school, actually those have been in some senses easier for parents to deal with than having to deal with the after school care on the other 4 days.
And would any assumption, if a school was to do this, be that there would be longer hours and shorter holidays the rest of the time?
That's been the model that most schools have adopted. There are other flexible models. Some schools, for example, do 4.5 days. Some have used holiday time, sort of reduced holiday time in the summer, for example. And there's various things, but generally, yes, it's been a longer day on 4 days.
Well, there's an interesting idea. Just one last thought then. Would you have welcomed it when you were a teacher?
Well, I did. I used to work 4 days a week and sort of cram all my time into that so that I could spend it at home. But basically that was done, that was for paperwork. But I was able to do it to manage a family at home. So it did benefit me in some ways, certainly.
Lucy Rycroft-Smith, thank you very much. I think I would have loved that when I was at school. But anyway, just time for tonight's closing headline. EU leaders have spent the day insisting they won't renegotiate the Brexit withdrawal agreement. They said the insurance policy designed to prevent physical checks on the Irish border must stand, despite Theresa May's attempts to change it. That's The World Tonight. I'm Rithala Shah. You can email us world.tonight@bbc.co.uk. But for now, from me and everyone on the programme, good night.